What happens when the man in handcuffs holds more power than those who arrested him? In Hollow Creek, a black man charged with loitering is mocked, silenced, and humiliated until the truth crashes through the courtroom walls. He isn't just another defendant. He's the senior commander of the FBI's National Task Force. Stay tuned, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video for more powerful stories that reveal hidden truths. The night was ordinary in Hollow Creek, the kind of small rural county where the streets fell silent after 9. The gas station lights hummed against the dark, and every unfamiliar face was noticed before it even parked. Commander Darius Cole sat quietly outside an empty brick warehouse, his sedan pulled neatly against the curb, the engine off. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, disciplined, his presence carrying the calm weight of a man used to control. Yet tonight, under the faint orange glow of a flickering streetlight, control was about to be stolen from him. He was not loitering. He was waiting. His colleague, another federal officer returning from an interview, was due to arrive in less than 10 minutes. Darius had spent 2 decades leading men and women into situations where seconds decided life and death. Waiting in silence was not new to him. But to the deputies who rolled slowly past in their cruiser, his presence was read through a different lens. A black man, alone, outside a closed business after dark. Suspicion, not truth, guided their perception. The cruiser braked hard, tires crunching gravel. 2 beams of white light splashed against Darius's windshield, blinding in their suddenness. He sat still, hands visible on the steering wheel, instinctively performing the ritual every black man in America knew. Make no sudden moves. The driver's door opened. Boots struck pavement. A voice rang out, sharp and commanding, though dripping with presumption. "Step out of the vehicle, now!" Deputy Ryan Maddox. Thick-necked, brash, his presence radiated arrogance. Behind him, his partner Sheriff Clayton Briggs emerged slower, older but no less sure of his authority. Both men carried the casual confidence of officers who believed the night, the county, and the law itself belonged to them. Darius stepped out carefully, his tall frame unfolding with deliberate calm. He spoke evenly, his baritone voice steady. "Is there a problem, officers?" Maddox smirked, circling him like a predator eyeing prey. "Problem? Yeah. You're parked outside a closed business after hours. That's loitering. That's suspicious. What are you doing here?" "I'm waiting for a colleague," Darius said simply. His eyes did not waver. Briggs snorted, folding thick arms across his chest. "A colleague. At 10:15 at night. Out here. You expect us to buy that?" Maddox stepped closer, his breath hot with mockery. "You got ID on you, tough guy?" He didn't wait for an answer. His hands gripped Darius's arm and yanked it back roughly, the cold metal of cuffs biting his wrist before he could finish his sentence. "I was reaching for my—" "Save it," Maddox cut him off, tightening the cuffs harder than necessary. "You fit the profile. Out of place, hanging around. Looks like trouble to me." Darius didn't resist. Resistance was fuel for their assumptions. He stood tall, posture relaxed, gaze fixed not on Maddox but somewhere beyond, as if seeing through him entirely. His silence unnerved the deputy, who expected pleading, anger, maybe even fear. But instead, Darius's stillness mocked their false authority without a word. The warehouse stood empty, its rusted shutters closed, but the scene outside unfolded like theater. A small group gathered near the gas station across the street, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward the tall man now in handcuffs. To them, the sight told its own story, before evidence ever entered. A black man under arrest must have done something. The murmur of judgment spread faster than the truth ever could. Maddox shoved him toward the cruiser, the metallic thud of the door echoing as Darius was pressed against it for a search. Briggs leaned in close, his gravelly voice low enough only Darius could hear. "Should have stayed home tonight. Out here, we keep things simple. You don't belong, you don't linger. That's the way it works." Darius blinked once, slowly. His voice was calm, even gentle. "You didn't ask for ID before you cuffed me." That was all he said. But the words, spoken with composure instead of defiance, lodged themselves into the silence that followed. Maddox sneered, masking unease with arrogance. "ID won't help you. You're not from here. Out-of-state plates, hanging around businesses, that's all I need." Inside the cruiser, the cuffs tight around his wrists, Darius stared through the glass at the night sky. To any other man, the moment might have felt like humiliation. To him, it was a study in patience. He had been in war zones where entire cities waited on his command. He had negotiated with warlords, led raids in hostile deserts, directed entire task forces against organized crime. Now, in this rural county where his name carried no recognition, he sat quietly as two small men mistook their limited jurisdiction for absolute power. The radio crackled with Maddox's voice as he called in the arrest. "Suspect detained, loitering near the old Harrington warehouse, bringing him in for processing." Processing. The word hung heavy in the air. In the gallery of the courthouse the next morning, it would shape into whispers, into assumptions, into the buzzing hum of prejudice that painted Darius Cole not as a commander, not as a leader of federal men and women, but as a threat. His broad shoulders, his quiet posture, his dark skin, to them, these were marks not of dignity, but of danger. The irony was bitter. The man they mocked as suspicious was, in truth, the highest-ranking law enforcement figure any of them had ever been in a room with. The senior commander of the FBI's National Task Force on Organized Crime and Counterterrorism sat in handcuffs, unrecognized, unacknowledged, treated as less than human because of an old reflex, to see color before character, suspicion before truth. When the cruiser rolled toward the Hollow Creek station, gravel spitting beneath its tires, Maddox leaned back with a grin. Another night, another clean arrest. This one's easy paperwork. Briggs chuckled beside him. "Yeah, you can smell guilt on some of them. This one's no different. Just look at him." Darius said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence filled the car more than words ever could. Maddox glanced at him in the rearview mirror, unsettled by the calm in those eyes. It wasn't the look of a man caught, or a man defeated. It was the look of a man waiting. And though Maddox didn't know it, though the sheriff didn't sense it, though the gathering crowd at the gas station could not possibly imagine it, that silence was not weakness. It was the prelude to revelation. For in less than 24 hours, the same courtroom that mocked him would fall into stunned silence when they learned who Darius Cole truly was. For now, though, he rode in the back of the cruiser, cuffed like a criminal. The false charge of loitering would appear on the docket by morning. The gallery would lean forward, whispering judgments, blind to the truth. And Hollow Creek, that quiet county that thought it owned the night, had just arrested the storm it could not contain. The sun rose over Hollow Creek with a dull, indifferent glow, its pale light spilling through the dusty windows of the old county courthouse. The building itself looked tired, worn down by decades of hearings, arraignments, and half-hearted trials that had less to do with justice and more to do with habit. Its faded flags drooped in the corners, and the cracked seal above the judge's bench seemed to mock the very idea of law. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of stale coffee and polished wood, mingling with something heavier. Expectation. Commander Darius Cole sat at the defense table, wrists free now, but dignity still bruised by the absurdity of the previous night. The charge of loitering was written plainly on the docket, as if ink could mask the absurdity. Around him, whispers rippled in waves. People leaned toward one another, eyes darting, murmuring about that man who had been picked up near the warehouse. No one asked what he was really doing there. No one cared. The image of a black man in cuffs was enough to write their narrative before the gavel struck. Then the doors banged open. The sound was like a rifle shot through the chamber, silencing the murmurs. Heads turned sharply as Officer Ryan Maddox strode in. He was broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, polished boots clicking with each step, as though he wanted the sound to echo. Maddox didn't just enter a room, he consumed it. His chin was tilted high, his smirk carved deep across his face, his entire posture declaring that this was his house. He spotted Darius immediately. His lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile, dripping with mockery. Maddox leaned down slightly as he passed the defense table, his voice a low growl meant to cut. "Didn't expect you to show your face, boy." The word lingered like smoke, foul and deliberate. A few people in the gallery chuckled under their breath, complicit in the insult. Darius, however, didn't move. He blinked slowly, the way a man blinks when he's heard the same line too many times to give it weight. His calm was unnerving in its power. It was not the calm of ignorance, but the calm of someone who knew precisely what was unfolding and had no intention of surrendering to its script. Maddox didn't notice. Or maybe he couldn't. He was too drunk on his own authority, too used to his swagger carrying the day. He dropped heavily into his seat near the sheriff, sprawling as if the bench were his throne. His eyes never left Darius, a predator circling prey. But the truth was far more complicated. Maddox was circling something far larger than he could see. Blind to the trap his arrogance had built, Leah Monroe, Darius's attorney, leaned closer. Her voice was steady but quiet. "Don't engage him. Let me handle this." Darius tilted his head slightly, his gaze still fixed forward. His baritone voice was soft, almost detached. "They don't want my truth. Not from me." She looked at him, searching his face, and for a fleeting second she saw something strange in his stillness. Not defeat, but discipline. The way he breathed in 4 seconds, out 4 seconds. A rhythm born from years of training in places where silence and control meant survival. She didn't know who her client truly was yet. Not fully, but she sensed layers hidden beneath the calm. Judge Rebecca Hanlon entered then, her robes dragging across the floor, her perpetual frown deepened by the early hour. She glanced at the docket, then at Darius, and her cool gaze lingered with a chill that spoke more than words. To her, too, the man before her wasn't a commander, wasn't a federal leader, wasn't even presumed innocent. He was just another black defendant taking up her time. The gavel rapped once. "Court is in session." The buzz quieted, though tension hummed like a live wire. Maddox leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his broad chest, growing wider as if he could already taste victory. He radiated contempt with every glance, every movement. Contempt for Darius, contempt for Leah, contempt for the very idea that anyone could challenge his narrative. The prosecutor stood, calling Maddox to the stand. He rose with deliberate slowness, his boots striking the floor like drum beats as he approached the witness box. Every step radiated confidence, the kind of confidence born not of truth, but of unchecked power. When he swore his oath, his voice dripped authority. "I do." He turned his gaze squarely on Darius, and the courtroom felt smaller under his stare. "When I approach the defendant, he began, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner. He was agitated, belligerent, the kind of man who thinks rules don't apply to him. He let the words hang heavy, his smirk deepening. You never know when people like that will turn violent. The phrase, people like that, fell with the weight of a hammer. Everyone knew what it meant. Maddox hadn't said the word, but he didn't need to. His eyes, his tone, his history carried it clearly. Leah shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. That is prejudicial and without basis. Judge Hanlon didn't even look up from her notes. Overruled. Leah sank back into her seat, her jaw clenched. Maddox grinned, relishing the power of his words, feeding off the validation of the judge's indifference. But Darius remained still. His hands, folded neatly on the table, tightened just enough for his knuckles to pale. He didn't look at Maddox. He didn't flinch at the words. Instead, he drew another deep breath. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out, grounding himself in the rhythm of endurance. He had faced far worse than this. Yet it was the smallness of the insult, the narrowness of Maddox's view, that carried its own sting. The gallery leaned forward, enthralled not by justice, but by spectacle. To them, Maddox was the hero, the uniform, the authority. Darius was the shadow, the question mark, the defendant. Few noticed the imbalance, fewer cared. And still, the commander sat silent, because silence, in the hands of a man like Darius Cole, was not surrender. It was resistance sharpened into something the room could not name. Maddox thought he was winning, blind to the truth that every sneer, every slur, every arrogant step only built the weight of his own fall. For now, though, the swagger filled the courtroom like smoke, thick and choking. And the man who strutted so proudly before the county's eyes had no idea that within days his name would be reduced to a cautionary whisper, while the silent figure he mocked would be revealed as a storm far greater than any badge he carried. The courtroom air was heavy, as though every breath drawn inside it carried the weight of suspicion. Officer Ryan Maddox leaned back in his chair, his thick arms crossed, his smirk widening with each word he had already planted in the record. To him, the trial wasn't about evidence or truth. It was about dominance. He had strutted in with swagger, spit venom from the stand, and the judge had sided with him. In his mind, the battle was already over. But across from him, at the defense table, Commander Darius Cole sat with the poise of a man who refused to be rattled. His shoulders were squared, his posture straight, but his hands were folded loosely before him, resting on the polished wood as if he were at a boardroom table instead of awaiting judgment. His face was unreadable, a mask carved of restraint. The silence unnerved Maddox. He expected fire. He expected anger. He expected the kind of outburst that would confirm his every bias and make the judge's gavel slam in his favor. But Darius gave him nothing. No flinch, no glare, no muttered retort. Just quiet. Unyielding calm. Darius's breaths came in steady rhythm. In for 4 seconds. Out for 4. The discipline of breathing wasn't something new to him. It had carried him through tense negotiations, through situations where one wrong word could spark violence, through nights where decisions made in split seconds determined whether his team lived or died. To Maddox, the silence looked like weakness. To Darius, it was strategy. Leah Monroe, his attorney, sat rigid beside him. Young, sharp, and principled, she had already thrown herself against the stone wall of Judge Hanlon's indifference and Maddox's prejudice. Every objection was swatted aside like a fly. Every legal motion was ignored or delayed. Her jaw was tight now, her eyes flicking between her client and the smirking officer in the corner. Leaning toward Darius, she spoke in a low, urgent voice. "Please, let me do the talking. This isn't the place to challenge him. They're not interested in your words. If you give them anything, they'll twist it." Her words carried the weight of experience, the sharp instincts of someone who had already seen too many men who looked like Darius be silenced by the system. She wasn't asking out of weakness, but out of caution. Darius turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since Maddox's arrival. His gaze was calm but piercing, like steel tempered by fire. His voice was a deep baritone, quiet enough that only she could hear. "They don't want my truth," he whispered. "Not from me." The words lingered between them, heavy with double meaning. Leah swallowed hard, recognizing both the pain and the discipline behind them. He wasn't wrong. She knew it. The courtroom didn't want his truth because of who he was, because of the skin he wore, because of the assumptions already written on his body before he ever spoke. But there was something more in his tone, something layered beneath, as if his silence was not just resignation, but a shield, waiting for the right moment to strike. From the back of the courtroom, Maddox shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing at the whisper he couldn't hear. The silence from Darius, the refusal to rise to the bait, unsettled him. Maddox thrived on reactions, on fear, on anger, on proof that his intimidation worked. But the man across the room gave him nothing, and that nothing was louder than any outburst. The gallery, too, began to feel it. Whispers died down, eyes lingered longer on the defendant who sat so calmly, while the officer who had cuffed him strutted like a conqueror. It was as though the room itself began to sense an imbalance, a current running beneath the surface, quiet but unstoppable. Leah pressed her lips together, resisting the urge to push harder. She wanted to fight for him with every word, but she also began to realize that his silence was its own kind of testimony. Where Maddox had swagger, Darius had stillness. Where Maddox spat venom, Darius absorbed it like a wall of stone. The contrast was undeniable, and even Judge Hanlon, with her narrowed eyes and stiff posture, seemed unsettled by it. The prosecutor cleared his throat, preparing to continue Maddox's performance of authority, but the weight in the room had shifted ever so slightly. Darius sat unmoving, his silence commanding more attention than the officer's bravado. His breathing remained steady. In for 4 seconds, out for 4. Each cycle grounding him deeper, reminding him that truth didn't always need to be shouted to be heard. Maddox drummed his fingers against the bench, restless now. His earlier sneer faltered just for a moment as he glanced at Darius again. The defendant's calm didn't make sense to him. Men in chains were supposed to rage or collapse. They were supposed to beg for leniency or lash out in anger. Silence robbed Maddox of his script, left him with nothing to feed on. It was an insult without words, a defiance without movement. Leah leaned back slightly, her eyes on her client. She began to understand. His silence wasn't surrender. It was patience. It was power biding its time. And though no one in that courtroom knew it yet, Maddox's contempt would be his undoing, while Darius's quiet defiance would soon thunder louder than any gavel in Hollow Creek. The clock on the wall ticked, each second dragging in the thick silence. The case moved forward, motions filed, testimony rehearsed, but the heart of the battle was already drawn in the quiet between two men. One puffed with arrogance, the other calm as stone. Darius Cole didn't need to shout to make himself heard. His very stillness unsettled the room in ways words never could. And in that stillness, the seeds of reckoning were already taking root. The hush of the courtroom deepened as Officer Ryan Maddox swaggered his way to the stand, his boots clicking against the hardwood floor like a drummer's march to war. He carried himself with the same cocky arrogance that had filled the air since he first entered. Broad-shouldered, chin high, his uniform crisp as if ironed by pride itself. But beneath the polished brass and navy blue fabric, the venom in his smirk betrayed the performance. Judge Rebecca Hanlon, perched high above on her bench, nodded with mechanical efficiency, her gavel hand resting lightly at her side. Her face was carved in stern lines, as if decades of disinterest had hardened her into stone. Her eyes swept briefly over Maddox, then landed on Darius Cole at the defense table. To anyone else, it might have been a neutral look. To Leah Monroe, sitting at Darius's side, it was a signal. The scales weren't balanced, and the weight of prejudice was already pressing down. The oath was given. Maddox's right hand shot up with mock solemnity. His voice, dripping with false conviction, carried across the room. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." He sat down with a thud, leaned back in the chair, and folded his arms as if he already owned the outcome. The prosecutor's voice was measured, designed to draw out a performance rather than facts. "Officer Maddox, can you recount for the court what happened the night of Mr. Cole's arrest?" Maddox leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his words deliberate. "When I approached the defendant, he was agitated, belligerent, the kind of man who thinks rules don't apply to him." His tone was authoritative, every syllable carefully chosen to sound factual, reasonable, undeniable. From the start, he was combative. He refused simple commands. He escalated the encounter. Leah shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That's a gross mischaracterization without evidence." Judge Hanlon's gaze didn't even flicker toward her. "Overruled." The word cracked like a whip. Leah sat down, fury tightening her jaw, while Maddox's grin widened. He had been waiting for this stage, and the judge's complicity was his green light. Maddox pressed on, his voice lowering just enough to sound conspiratorial, intimate with the jury and gallery. "You never know with people like that. They can turn violent in a second." The phrase landed like a sledgehammer in the room. People like that. The words carried more than their surface meaning. Everyone heard the unspoken bias coiled inside. Black skin, broad shoulders, a man who dared to stand tall instead of slouching in submission. Maddox didn't have to say the rest. The room filled it in for him. At the defense table, Darius didn't move. His silence remained intact, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. But Leah felt the blow land. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles whitened. She rose again. "Objection! Your Honor, this language is prejudicial and inflammatory. It has no place in testimony." Judge Hanlon adjusted her glasses, her face unreadable, and said with cool detachment, "Overruled. The witness may continue." The imbalance was laid bare. The rules of justice bent like reeds under the weight of Maddox's authority and the judge's indifference. To the gallery, it looked like procedure. To Leah, it was betrayal, carved into the very foundation of the courtroom. Maddox leaned back, satisfied. His voice swelled with confidence. "The defendant refused to comply with my orders." His tone was hostile, his body language aggressive. "I was concerned for my safety, and for the safety of others nearby. We had no choice but to detain him." Lies rolled off his tongue with the ease of habit, his story polished from years of practice. Every sentence sharpened the picture he wanted the court to see. A dangerous man, unpredictable, uncontrollable. A threat in need of restraint. Leah's voice broke in, sharp and clear. "Officer Maddox, are you aware that Mr. Cole was standing alone, waiting outside a business for a colleague?" "Do you have any evidence he was engaged in illegal activity?" Maddox smirked, tilting his head. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't wait until a man throws a punch to recognize danger." His behavior spoke for itself. Leah took a step forward, her voice like steel. "So your evidence is not action, not fact, not law. Your evidence is how Mr. Cole looked to you?" The gallery shifted, a murmur rippling through the benches. It was the first crack in Maddox's performance, but Judge Hanlon was quick to patch it. "Counselor, enough editorializing. Ask your questions directly or sit down." Leah clenched her teeth but obeyed, retreating slowly, her eyes flashing fire as she sat beside her client. Darius turned his head slightly toward her, his voice a whisper, barely audible. "You see? They don't want my truth." Maddox wasn't finished. He leaned in closer to the microphone, savoring the authority the courtroom gave him. "These encounters are dangerous. You hesitate, you risk lives. And people like him." He paused deliberately, eyes flicking toward Darius. "They escalate things. It's what they do." Gasps fluttered in the gallery. The venom in his phrasing was unmistakable now. Leah sprang up again. "Objection! Your Honor, the witness is generalizing and using racially charged language to poison the perception of my client." Judge Hanlon didn't hesitate. "Overruled. Sit down, Ms. Monroe." The words echoed louder than any gavel strike. The imbalance was complete. The scales of justice weren't just tilted. They were nailed to the floor. Maddox knew it, Hanlon knew it, the gallery knew it. And in that moment, Leah realized the game wasn't about law anymore. It was about narrative. And Maddox's narrative, soaked in bias, coated in authority, and shielded by the judge's robe, was winning. But across the table, Darius Cole sat silent, immovable. His quiet defiance had not cracked. The man who had been painted as agitated and combative remained the calmest figure in the room. That calm was a statement louder than Maddox's testimony, louder than the judge's rulings. It was the patience of a man who knew storms didn't last forever. The record might have been written against him in that moment. But the truth, his truth, had not yet spoken, and when it did, it would break the foundation Maddox thought was unshakable. The silence hung, heavy as a verdict. Maddox smiled. Leah burned. Judge Hanlon presided with cold detachment. "And Darius?" He breathed. In for 4 seconds, out for 4. The quiet storm was building, and though the court couldn't hear it yet, the thunder was coming. The courtroom air was already heavy, thick with the residue of Maddox's poisonous words. His testimony lingered like smoke after a fire, choking truth out of the room. Judge Rebecca Hanlon's rulings, each one clipped, cold, and dismissive, had solidified the imbalance. Leah Monroe sat stiff at the defense table, her hands clasped tight, her mind racing with the futility of objections that fell like whispers into a storm. And beside her, Commander Darius Cole sat as he had since the beginning. Calm, still, his silence cutting sharper than any rebuttal. Maddox stepped down from the witness stand. His chest puffed with triumph, his stride purposeful. He had painted the picture he wanted. Darius as a threat, a danger, an unpredictable menace. In Maddox's mind, the gallery saw what he wanted them to see. He strutted like a man whose story had sealed the trial before it even began. But Maddox wasn't done. Not with his lies, not with his performance, and certainly not with Darius. He detoured from the aisle that would have taken him back to his seat. Instead, he walked slowly, deliberately, toward the defense table. Each step was measured, his boots striking the floor with weight, each one louder than the last. The gallery's murmurs hushed, sensing something was about to snap. He leaned in as he passed, his voice a low hiss meant for Darius alone. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Darius did not move. His gaze remained steady on some invisible point just beyond the courtroom's stale wooden walls. His breathing was calm, his body language serene, as though Maddox's presence were no more than a gust of wind passing by. And that's when it happened. A flash of malice flickered in Maddox's eyes. His boot shot out fast, concealed by the table's edge, the motion hidden from most of the gallery. The strike landed hard against Darius's shin with a dull thud that seemed to echo louder than gunfire in the tense silence. Gasps erupted instantly. The gallery rose in a ripple of shock, whispers slicing through the still air like knives. Leah shot to her feet, fury blazing in her eyes, her finger stabbing the air toward Maddox. "Your Honor!" she shouted, her voice sharp, ringing against the wooden beams above. "The officer just assaulted my client in open court." Judge Hanlon's gaze snapped up, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressing into a thin, dangerous line. The gavel hovered, but she didn't strike it. Instead, her voice came down like ice. "Counsel, sit down, or I will clear this courtroom." With respect, Leah's voice did not tremble, though the heat of injustice tremored through her veins. "Let the record reflect that the officer physically struck my client. Here, in this courtroom, under your supervision." The judge's glare sharpened, her words a cold blade. "The record will reflect whatever I say it reflects. Now move on." A hush fell. Not silence, not peace, but the kind of suffocating quiet that crushes breath and strangles words. The gallery sat frozen, their disbelief a living thing that pulsed against the walls. Darius hadn't flinched. His hands remained folded on the table, his body still. The sting of Maddox's boot radiated up his leg, but his face betrayed nothing. His composure was intact, untouchable. He breathed in for 4 seconds, out for 4, the rhythm as steady as the man himself. Years of discipline, years of understanding when to fight and when to wait, had trained him for this moment. But Maddox, basking in the silent chaos he had created, smirked. His eyes swept the gallery, daring anyone to challenge him, confident that no one would. He turned slowly, striding back toward his seat, his posture that of a victor walking off the battlefield. Leah, however, wasn't finished. She leaned close to Darius, her voice low but fierce, meant only for him. "We can't let that stand." Darius turned his head slightly, his baritone barely above a whisper. "We already didn't. Everyone saw it. Everyone heard your words. That's enough for now." She searched his face, trying to read the storm she sensed behind his calm exterior. But Darius gave her nothing but stillness. A silence so composed it felt like a verdict of its own. In the back of the courtroom, a woman leaned forward, her pen frozen above her notepad. Nora Vega, a local reporter who had come expecting another forgettable case of petty charges, had just witnessed what could not be buried. An officer's violence, a judge's complicity, a defendant's dignity that refused to shatter. Her eyes narrowed, her instincts firing. This was no minor story. This was something far bigger. The recess bell rang, breaking the tension like a hammer shattering glass. The gallery spilled into the hallway, whispers curling like smoke, repeating the same incredulous words. He kicked him. He actually kicked him. And the judge did nothing. Maddox strutted past, his smirk wider than ever, his arrogance reinforced by the silence of authority that shielded him. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't fathom, was the shift in the air. The gallery had gasped. Leah had shouted. The truth had been witnessed. He had exposed himself, and though Judge Hanlon had buried the record, the memory was carved into every eye that had seen it, every ear that had heard it. Back at the defense table, Darius sat motionless, his face unreadable. But within the silence, something was growing. Not anger, not despair, but resolve. The courtroom had mocked him, struck him, denied him. Yet still he sat, unbroken. His quiet was not surrender. It was a waiting storm. The assault had not ended the trial. It had rewritten it. The scales of justice might have been forced down by bias and corruption, but they had tilted too far. And when they snapped back, the recoil would be thunderous. In that moment, Leah knew Maddox's boot had done more than bruise her client's leg. It had cracked the facade. It had revealed to everyone in that room, gallery, clerk, even Nora Vega with her poised pen, the truth Maddox and Judge Hanlon had tried to bury. Darius Cole was no ordinary defendant, and sooner than anyone expected, the world was about to find out why. The courthouse hallways buzzed with low whispers, like bees unsettled in their hive. The moment Officer Ryan Maddox's boot connected with Darius Cole's leg had already become folklore inside those walls, repeated, retold, reshaped in the mouths of every witness. He kicked him. The words coiled like smoke, filling the air with disbelief and dread. Some told it in hushed tones, others in angry bursts, but no one could escape the truth of what they had seen. Maddox strutted down the hall, his smirk planted like a flag of victory, while Judge Rebecca Hanlon retreated to chambers, her gavel unused, her authority shaken. Yet, amid the noise, one man stood apart. Miles Grant, the court clerk, a quiet man in his late 50s, with a receding hairline and glasses perpetually slipping down his nose, shuffled papers at his desk. His motions were deliberate, but his mind raced with what he had witnessed. He had been in this courthouse for over 20 years, had watched case after case grind through the machinery of bias, but something about this day lodged in his chest, like a stone. He had seen injustices swept under rugs, seen defendants silenced, but never had he seen an officer strike a man in plain view, and the judge refused to even acknowledge it.
Miles had known enough law to understand one thing. Silence in the record was still violence in reality. If nothing changed, today would vanish into the void like so many others. Maddox's smirk told him that much, but Miles wasn't ready to let it vanish.
During the recess, while the gallery spilled into the hall and Maddox bathed in the attention of his allies, Miles slipped into a narrow side office where the courthouse phones still hummed with old copper wiring. He closed the door gently, hands trembling just enough that he had to steady them against the desk. He picked up the receiver, dialed a number burned into his memory, and prayed someone would answer. "Department of Justice, Washington," came the voice on the other end. Miles hesitated for just a heartbeat, then spoke. His voice was low, urgent, almost conspiratorial. "This is Miles Grant, clerk for Judge Rebecca Hanlon in Hollow Creek County. I need to report an ongoing miscarriage of justice involving Commander Darius Cole."
The pause on the other end was brief but sharp. "Repeat that. Did you say Commander Darius Cole?"
"Yes," Miles whispered. "He's sitting in our courtroom right now. They've arrested him on charges so flimsy they wouldn't hold an ounce of water. And worse." His throat tightened. "One of the arresting officers just assaulted him in open court." The judge refused to acknowledge it. There was another silence, heavier this time, broken by the clipped rustle of papers and the urgency in the voice that returned. "Stay on the line. Do not disconnect. This is being escalated immediately." Miles exhaled, a shudder running through him. He didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but for the first time all morning, he felt he had cracked the wall of silence. Minutes later, Back in the courtroom, the buzz of gossip had dulled into an uneasy murmur. People were settling back into their benches, the weight of the recess still pressing down like humidity before a storm. Maddox lounged in his chair, boots stretched out, arms folded across his broad chest, grinning at the gallery as though daring them to challenge his dominance. Darius sat at the defense table, composed as ever, his breathing steady, his posture calm. Leah Monroe leaned toward him, frustration still radiating from her frame.
"They can't bury this forever," she murmured.
"They'll try," Darius replied evenly, "but truth has a way of finding the cracks." As if on cue, the sharp ring of the courtroom's desk phone sliced through the murmur like a knife. The sound was jarring in its timing, crisp, insistent, impossible to ignore. Heads turned, whispers stilled. Miles, already back at his station, stiffened as though bracing for impact. He lifted the receiver slowly. "This is the Hollow Creek County Court," he said, his voice steady but his palms damp. The voice on the other end was precise, urgent. "This is the Department of Justice. We require immediate contact with Judge Rebecca Hanlon. Put her on the line." Miles's eyes flickered across the courtroom to the bench where Judge Hanlon was just re-entering. For a second, he felt the weight of what he was about to unleash. Then he covered the receiver with his hand and spoke, his words trembling slightly as they left his lips. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying into the quiet room, "an urgent call. They say it's from the Department of Justice. They're asking for you by name." The air froze. A ripple of shock moved through the gallery like a physical wave. The Department of Justice? For a loitering case in Hollow Creek? Maddox's smirk faltered for the first time. Leah's head snapped toward the bench, her sharp eyes narrowing with sudden recognition that the tide was shifting. Darius, still seated, remained calm, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a knowing glint, as though he had been waiting for this very moment.
Judge Hanlon, her frown deepening, stepped toward the phone. "The Department of Justice?" she repeated, skepticism dripping from her tone. "This had better not be a prank." Miles swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor, they were very clear. They asked for you by name." Hanlon snatched the receiver with a huff of irritation, pressing it to her ear. "This is Judge Rebecca Hanlon." The room held its collective breath. For a few seconds, her face remained composed, lips pressed tight, eyes darting to the ceiling as though bracing against some unseen weight. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, her posture shifted. Her back stiffened, her grip on the receiver tightened. Her eyes, once cold and dismissive, flickered toward Darius Cole.
"You're certain?" she said, her voice no longer icy but strained, almost fragile. "Yes. Yes, I understand. No, he hasn't. Yes, I'll comply." She hung up the phone. The receiver landed in its cradle with a dull clack that seemed to echo louder than Maddox's kick had. The silence was deafening. Judge Hanlon's face was pale now, her lips pressed into a thin line. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, almost mechanical. "This court will now take an extended recess. 30 minutes. A matter of national security has arisen."
Gasps rippled again. National security? For a loitering case? For the man sitting silently at the defense table?
Maddox barked a short, arrogant laugh, though it lacked the bite it once had. "What's next? UFOs landing in the parking lot?" he muttered, trying to recover his swagger. But no one joined him this time. The gallery's eyes weren't on him anymore. They were on Darius. In the hallways outside, whispers swirled faster than the air could carry them. The Pentagon? The DOJ? What's going on? Reporters scribbled furiously. Nora Vega, her instincts sharpening like a blade, pressed deeper into the throng, scribbling every word, every reaction. Back at the defense table, Leah leaned closer, her whisper taut. "What's happening? Darius, who are you really?" Darius didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed forward, calm, almost distant, as though seeing beyond the walls of this courthouse. Finally, in that low baritone that carried the weight of command, he murmured, "It's complicated."
Miles, sitting at his desk, exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. His quiet intervention had cracked the silence wide open. Whatever came next, Hollow Creek would never be the same.
The tension in the Hollow Creek County Courthouse was so thick, it felt like a living thing, pressing against the walls, holding its breath. Judge Rebecca Hanlon's announcement of a matter of national security had set the gallery ablaze with whispers. 30 minutes of recess wasn't enough to cool the room's heat. It only stoked the fire. Everyone wanted to know, who exactly was this man sitting quietly at the defense table? Why had the Department of Justice called their courtroom in the middle of nowhere about a man accused of loitering? Darius Cole hadn't moved. His posture was as steady as stone, his breathing unhurried, his gaze fixed on something beyond the ordinary field of vision. Leah Monroe, his attorney, sat beside him, her legal pad untouched, her pen clutched so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. "Darius," she whispered, her voice edged with urgency. "You have to tell me what's going on. The DOJ doesn't call small-town courtrooms about baseless charges. Who are you, really?" Darius's lips curved ever so slightly, not into a smile, but into something closer to acknowledgement. "The truth," he said in a low baritone, "isn't meant to be spoken by me. Not yet." The doors opened, not with the casual squeak of bailiffs or the creak of townsfolk entering late, but with the unmistakable authority of men who belonged to something larger than Hollow Creek had ever imagined. The heavy oak doors swung wide, striking the walls with a crack that silenced every murmur in the gallery. 6 men strode in. Their suits were dark, crisp, perfectly cut, their shoes clicking against the floor with deliberate rhythm. The federal seal glinted from small pins on their lapels. At their center walked a tall man with silver at his temples and a presence that commanded the air itself. Alan Reeves, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every head in the room turned. Maddox's swagger deflated instantly. His smirk withered into a confused half-grimace. Sheriff Clayton Briggs, standing at the back of the room, folded his arms but couldn't hide the nervous twitch in his jaw. Judge Hanlon's gavel hand stiffened, though she dared not strike it down. Even Nora Vega, notebook ready, lowered her pen, realizing that this moment transcended journalism. The 6 men moved forward without hesitation, a tide of power that drowned out the arrogance lingering in the courtroom. Reeves's gaze scanned the room once, briefly, before settling directly on Darius Cole. His voice, when he spoke, was sharp enough to slice the silence in half. "Where is Commander Cole?" The gallery erupted in startled gasps. "Commander?" The word hung in the air like thunder. People turned toward Darius in waves, disbelief spreading across their faces. Maddox blinked, as if the sound had betrayed him personally. "Commander? What?" he muttered under his breath, though no one cared to listen. Darius finally stood. The scrape of his chair against the wooden floor echoed louder than any gavel. His frame, powerful and composed, unfolded into its full stature. For the first time since his arrest, he acknowledged the man who had entered. His eyes met Reeves's, and something electric passed between them. Recognition, respect, and gravity. "Director Reeves," Darius said, his voice steady, calm, yet heavy with meaning. Reeves nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement given rarely and only to equals. Then he turned toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Judge Hanlon, "with all due respect, there has been a grave error. The man you have before you is not a drifter, nor a loiterer. He is Commander Darius Cole, head of the FBI's National Task Force on Organized Crime and Counterterrorism. The words dropped like explosives in the room. The gallery erupted into chaos. Reporters clutched their pens, whispering furiously. Citizens gaped, mouths open, as though they had just been told the sun itself had been on trial. Maddox froze, his broad shoulders suddenly heavy under the weight of his own ignorance. Sheriff Briggs shifted uneasily, his boots scraping the floor as though the sound could shield him from the reality tightening around his neck. Judge Hanlon leaned back in her chair, her stern mask cracking just enough to reveal something else underneath. Disbelief, even fear. "That's impossible," she said, her voice brittle. "He was arrested for loitering?" Reeves cut her off sharply. "Yes, and that's the problem. This arrest was not only baseless, it was reckless. Do you understand what you've done?" He stepped forward, his gaze hardening. "Commander Cole's work is classified at the highest levels. His presence here in Hollow Creek was connected to active federal operations. Arresting him, mocking him, assaulting him in open court." He swept a hand toward Maddox, whose face had drained of all color. "Has jeopardized national security." The words sent a fresh wave of shock rolling through the gallery. Leah, still seated, her eyes wide, whispered under her breath, "My God!" She looked at Darius, who remained upright, composed, even as the truth about him detonated across the room. Reeves turned toward the defense table again. His tone softened, if only slightly. "Commander, I apologize that it came to this. We should have anticipated interference. But now that the truth is on record, we'll see this miscarriage corrected." Darius gave a single nod, his silence carrying the weight of everything unspoken. The humiliation, the restraint, the storm of injustice endured in quiet. Reeves turned back to the bench. "Your Honor, I am formally demanding immediate dismissal of all charges. Furthermore, every record of this arrest, every body cam file, every dispatch log, every transcript from this courtroom will be seized and secured as federal evidence. This court is no longer handling a local matter. It is now bound by federal oversight." The room shook with murmurs, people twisting in their seats, trying to absorb the reality of what was unfolding. Maddox shot to his feet, his voice cracking under strain. "This is outrageous! He's just another criminal! I don't care what badge you wave, he was—" "Sit down, Officer Maddox." Reeves's voice cut through him like steel. "You've said enough." Maddox faltered, his face twisting with rage and disbelief, but his body betrayed him, sinking slowly back into his chair. His swagger was gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man realizing the ground beneath him had collapsed. Judge Hanlon clutched her gavel, but her voice lacked the command it once carried. "Director Reeves, this is highly irregular. You can't just walk into my courtroom and—" Reeves cut her off again, his tone flat, unyielding. "This is not your courtroom anymore, Judge. This is the people's courtroom, and the people's law will not be mocked." Gasps spread again, but this time there was something else in the air. A sense that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Nora Vega, her notebook trembling in her hands, scribbled furiously. The headline was already writing itself in her mind. "Senior FBI Commander Humiliated in Hollow Creek Courtroom. National Security Jeopardized by Local Arrest." The truth was no longer buried. It had arrived in the flesh, in the voice of the FBI's director, in the presence of the man who had sat silent while the county mocked him. And as the reality settled, Hollow Creek realized it wasn't just facing a man accused of loitering. It was facing the storm of accountability that follows when arrogance collides with truth. Darius Cole, once the defendant, now stood revealed as what he had always been. The quiet commander, the storm contained, the reckoning no one in that room had been prepared to face. The silence after Director Alan Reeves's words was unlike anything the Hollow Creek Courthouse had ever known. It wasn't the silence of boredom, or routine, or formality. It was the silence of reckoning, heavy, electric, trembling. For a moment, even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if the very weather itself leaned in to hear what would happen next. At the defense table, Commander Darius Cole remained standing, tall and steady, as if this moment was nothing more than the inevitable consequence of patience. At the prosecution's side, Officer Ryan Maddox shifted uneasily in his seat, his bravado collapsing like a house of cards in a windstorm. He had come into this courtroom hours earlier, strutting like a man invincible, spitting contempt and prejudice like it was oxygen. Now, under the gaze of the FBI director and the piercing calm of the man he'd mocked, Maddox looked smaller, frailer, stripped of his armor of arrogance. But the reckoning wasn't complete. Reeves's hand gestured subtly, and, from the back of the courtroom, two men in tailored suits moved forward. They weren't here to observe. They carried with them the sharp, clipped energy of enforcement. One of them held a folded document, embossed with a bright red seal that glinted under the flickering lights above the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Reeves said, his voice like steel wrapped in authority, "in addition to the dismissal of charges against Commander Cole, the Bureau is executing an arrest warrant." The gallery gasped, bodies leaning forward as if pulled by an unseen rope. Judge Rebecca Hanlon, who had so confidently overruled objections, silenced dissent, and narrowed the very definition of the record, shifted in her seat. Her gavel hovered just above the block, but never struck. Her power was slipping like sand between her fingers, and she knew it. Reeves turned, his eyes locking on Maddox. "Officer Ryan Maddox, you are under federal arrest for the assault of a federally protected official, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of law." The words detonated in the room. Maddox's mouth fell open, his voice clawing its way out. "What? No, this is insane. This is my courtroom, my county. You can't—" But he didn't finish. The agents had already moved. Their steps were precise, their pace unbroken, as if they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. One agent unfurled the document and handed it up to Judge Hanlon, who accepted it with trembling fingers. She scanned the words, her eyes flickering in disbelief. It was real, sealed, authorized. The ink of the United States government pressed firmly into the parchment. By then, the other agent had stepped beside Maddox. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the courtroom like a bell tolling the end of his reign. Cold steel snapped around Maddox's wrists, his broad shoulders jerking against the force that no amount of swagger could resist. "No, you don't get it. He's nothing. He's just—" Maddox's words spiraled into incoherence, his voice cracking as the agents hauled him to his feet. "This is my county. This is—" Darius Cole finally moved. Not much, just a turn of his head, his gaze steady, his voice low but resonant enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "Your county? That's the problem, officer. The law doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people." The gallery erupted in murmurs, a wave of energy surging across the benches. Some faces were lit with awe, others with shame, but all bore the weight of truth pressing down on them. Maddox's rage collapsed into silence, his chest heaving, his face pale as he realized his words had been answered not with more rage, but with the calm judgment of the man he had tried to humiliate. As Maddox was pulled toward the courtroom doors, the townsfolk witnessed something they had never expected to see. Not a black man in shackles, but the white officer who had mocked him being marched out in irons. The image burned into their eyes like scripture rewritten in real time. Nora Vega, the reporter from the Hollow Creek Tribune, scribbled furiously, her pen flying across the page. Her headline was already alive in her mind. Officer arrested in court after assaulting FBI commander. She looked at Darius, her breath caught, realizing she wasn't just documenting a story. She was recording history. Judge Hanlon cleared her throat, desperate to salvage a shred of authority. "This court," she began, but her voice faltered. The weight of what had transpired had broken through her mask of detachment. The record of her rulings, her dismissals, her complicity, all of it was now evidence. She looked at Maddox's empty chair, then at the warrant in her hand, and for the first time in her career, she appeared small, almost spectral, diminished by the very justice she had failed to uphold. Reeves turned back to her. "Judge Hanlon, your conduct in this courtroom will be reviewed. The Bureau will be preserving every transcript and recording of these proceedings. This is no longer a matter of Hollow Creek's discretion." Her gavel, once a weapon of control, lay idle. She pressed her lips together, her eyes dropping to the desk, the authority she had wielded so coldly, now reduced to ashes. Maddox's voice faded as the doors swung shut behind him, the sound of his protests muffled by the walls. The click of his boots on the tile, once a march of dominance, had become the shuffle of defeat. Darius lowered himself back into his chair. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though he were sitting not as a man exonerated, but as a commander preparing for the next stage of battle. Leah Monroe glanced at him, her eyes wide with awe, but Darius didn't meet her gaze. His focus remained on the table in front of him, his silence more powerful than any speech. The gallery, stunned, sat frozen for a long moment. Then whispers rose again, curling like smoke. Some spoke of justice, others of fear, but all knew that nothing in Hollow Creek would ever be the same again. The image of Maddox in chains would linger. The memory of Judge Hanlon, pale and silent, would remain. And above all, the sight of Darius Cole, standing calm and unbroken, would echo, a reminder that truth had a way of surviving mockery, and dignity could outlast even the deepest injustice. For Hollow Creek, the fall of Officer Maddox wasn't just the end of arrogance, it was the beginning of accountability. And for Darius Cole, it was only the first wave of the storm that had yet to break. The air inside the Hollow Creek courthouse still vibrated with the echoes of Ryan Maddox's downfall. The gallery, restless and breathless, had just watched the swaggering officer dragged out in cuffs by federal agents, his shouts muffled by the thick oak doors. Judge Rebecca Hanlon sat silent, her gavel untouched, her shoulders bowed beneath the knowledge that her complicity was now part of the official record. And in the midst of it all sat Darius Cole, calm as stone, his face lit not by triumph, but by something deeper. Resolve. For hours he had endured the sneers, the lies, the manufactured testimony, the sting of a boot against his leg. He had allowed silence to be his shield, and patience his weapon. But now the moment had come when silence alone was not enough. The courtroom, still hushed after Maddox's removal, felt suspended in a fragile stillness, as if waiting for one voice to name what everyone had just witnessed. Darius rose. He didn't slam his chair back, didn't raise his hands for attention. He simply stood, tall and steady, his frame filling the space with quiet authority. Every eye in the room turned to him. Leah Monroe, his attorney, looked up at him with a kind of reverence, knowing instinctively that whatever he was about to say would not be part of her argument, but part of history. His voice, when it came, was low, measured, but carried to every corner of the chamber like a bell in clear air. You thought the badge gave you power." The words hung there, sharp enough to cut. A ripple of breath shuddered through the benches. "But power was never yours," he continued, his gaze sweeping from the empty seat Maddox had left to Judge Hanlon's trembling hands, to the deputies who had sat silently complicit in the gallery. "It belongs to the law, and to the people it serves." The gallery erupted, not in cheers, not in claps, but in the electric hum of recognition. Heads nodded. Whispers crackled. Even those who had come expecting to see Darius broken now sat straighter, the weight of truth pressing into their bones. Reeves, standing near the back with his agents, allowed the faintest curve of approval to soften his face. He had seen commanders in war zones rally men with less power in their words than what Darius had just summoned in a single sentence. Judge Hanlon opened her mouth, then closed it again. No gavel strike could erase what had been spoken. No judicial decree could rewrite the simplicity of truth. Darius sat back down slowly, folding his hands. His eyes closed, not in exhaustion but in discipline, as though sealing the words inside himself as much as offering them to the world. That night, the courthouse emptied slowly, citizens spilling to the rain-slick streets, whispering about what they had just done. Said the fall of Maddox was long overdue. Others said it was the beginning of something bigger than Hollow Creek. And a few, who had been silent too long, wondered aloud whether silence was still an option at all. By dawn, the courthouse steps were washed clean by the night storm, the air carrying the cool freshness of a new beginning. Reporters gathered early, their notepads ready, their cameras trained on the door. Darius Cole stepped into the morning. He wasn't flanked by agents. He wasn't shielded by security. He walked alone, his dark suit marked only by the faint crease of where he had sat for hours the day before. The rising sun spilled gold across the stone steps, catching the edge of his face, making him appear almost carved from the morning itself. Leah Monroe caught up to him, her coat pulled tight against the early chill, her eyes bright with a mixture of exhaustion and admiration. "Commander," she said softly, falling into step beside him. "What comes next?" Darius paused on the top step. He looked out across Hollow Creek, the small town still waking, its rooftops glistening with dew, its streets already buzzing with the rumor of change. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply breathed, slow and steady, as he had done in the courtroom when boots struck his shin and lies filled the air. Then he turned, his voice carrying the same calm finality that had silenced an entire courtroom the day before. "Justice isn't a storm that fades," he said. "It's a duty we carry every single day." Leah nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking into her chest. She knew he wasn't speaking only of himself. He was speaking of her, of the clerk who had risked his position to make the call, of the citizens who had watched silently for too long. He was speaking of the country itself, of what it owed to its people and what its people owed to each other. The reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every syllable. The headline would travel beyond Hollow Creek, beyond the county, beyond the state. It would be shared in offices, in kitchens, in classrooms. Justice isn't a storm that fades. It's a duty we carry every single day. Darius didn't wait for questions. He didn't pose for cameras. He descended the steps with steady strides, disappearing into the new day with the certainty of a man who understood that victory was not an end, but a beginning. Behind him, the courthouse loomed, its pillars cracked, its windows streaked, but its walls forever changed by what had unfolded inside. The people who emerged from its doors carried something intangible with them, as though justice itself had finally stepped down from marble plaques and taken root in their hearts. And in the town square, where the sunlight pooled over cobblestones and the air smelled of wet earth. Darius Cole stopped once more, looking eastward as the sun climbed higher. He stood not as a defendant, not even as a commander, but as a man who had reminded a community, and perhaps a nation, that the law belongs not to the loudest voice or the heaviest hand, but to the people it was written to serve. The legacy of that day was not Ryan Maddox's fall, nor Rebecca Hanlon's shame, nor even the sudden revelation of who Darius truly was. The legacy was the truth spoken aloud, clear as sunrise, that power wielded without justice is nothing, and justice carried without duty is fleeting. Darius Cole carried both, and because he did, so too could the people who had watched him endure. And as the sun crested over Hollow Creek, washing its streets in gold, a new day began. Not for one man, not for one county, but for the very idea of justice itself. The story of Commander Darius Cole in Hollow Creek is more than a courtroom drama. It is a wake-up call to every American citizen. What began as a baseless arrest for loitering became a mirror of something far deeper: how fragile justice becomes when silence replaces accountability. Darius endured hours of mockery, lies, and even open assault. Yet his strength was not in shouting back. It was in holding steady until the truth shattered the performance of power. That truth revealed something every American must remember. Authority without justice is nothing, and justice without vigilance will vanish. 6 false charges, 3 missing recordings, 1 officer's arrogance, all of it nearly buried a man whose real identity was commander of the FBI's National Task Force. Imagine how many ordinary people, without rank or shield, slip through cracks like this every single day. That is why Darius's words must outlive the courtroom. Power was never yours. It belongs to the law and to the people it serves. The lesson is plain. Justice is not the storm that erupts in a moment of outrage. It is the duty we carry after the storm has passed, in our neighborhoods, our towns, our schools, and our courts. For every American, the call is urgent. Do not let silence make you complicit. Speak when you see abuse. Demand answers when power is misused. Remember that accountability is not federal overreach. It is federal responsibility, and it begins with us. Friends, if this story moved you, if it reminded you that justice belongs to the people, then stand with us. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next reckoning. Like this video so the algorithm doesn't bury it. Push it higher where more citizens can see. Share it with your friends, your family, your community, because silence is what injustice depends on, and truth is what keeps it accountable. Justice isn't a storm that fades. It's a duty we carry every single day. Let's carry it together.